Next class, Hanumanji has come back. He has not reached Ram yet, but he came back to the group of Vanars and Jamvan also, who were waiting for him. So that's why this title of this chapter is A Hero Returns, page number 342. When they heard Hanuman roaring above them, Jamvan cried to Angad and his monkeys on the beach, "He has found her, or he wouldn't roar so loudly." So the Vanars ran up Mehandra in a frenzy of hope, pulling up plants and small trees around them, spraying the hillside with their joy. They scrambled, shouting up the mountain. As they came, they broke the most colorful branches from the trees and waved them aloft like a sea of flowery torches. And when they met the returning hero coming down the mountain, their excitement knew no bounds. Angad embraced Hanuman again and again, and the others all bowed at his feet quaintly, with palms folded. Some of them had brought fruit and savory roots, which they had gathered on their way up. They offered these to Hanuman, guessing that perhaps he had not eaten since he left these shores. Hanuman bowed to Angad and Jamvan. As the sun sank below the waves, they fell silent and stood gravely around him, waiting for him to speak. Suddenly, a smile creased his kindly face, and Hanuman raised his voice and cried. So everyone heard him, and that place echoed with what he said. In Ravan's Ashokvan, I saw Sita. The army of monkeys roared. They sprang high into the air. They turned cartwheels on the ground and the branches of the trees and gibbered in delight. Hanuman held up a solemn hand and said, "She sat surrounded by Rakshasas who guarded her night and day. Her face was covered with dirt, streaked with the tears that flowed ceaselessly from her lotus eyes. She was skin and bones from hardly eating. She took only enough food and water to keep her soul in her body. Her black hair was twisted into a braid like a serpent. It was grievous to see the noble Sita like that." Angad cried, "There is no one like you in all the world. You have crossed the sea and come back with the news of Ram's wife." Mehandra was splendid with the Vanar warriors upon its slopes, a vivid army lit by the last rays of the sun. A pang of hunger seized Hanuman, who scarcely remembered he had not eaten at all since he crept into Ravan's city a day and night ago. He took a fruit from one of the Vanars nearest him and began to chew on its flesh. Jamvan cried that Hanuman should be allowed to eat in peace. He must be hungry indeed, after his adventure across the ocean. Once the first mouthful passed his lips, he knew how ravenous he was, and Hanuman ate quite a quantity of fruit and tender roots. When he had filled his belly, he belched softly and smiled. Then Jamban said, "Tell us everything now. Just as you went hungry for food since you left, we have waited hungrily for your news. Tell us every detail of your adventure so we may share in it completely. Tell us about Sita and how Ravan treats her. Tell us all we should know and decide in your wisdom whatever we may not yet be told. But tell us, we are impatient to hear." Hanuman rose. He paid solemn obeisance to the south where Sita was. Then he told them about his flight across the sea and all his adventures in Lanka. He ended by saying, "Then from the top of the mountain Arisht, I leaped back to these shores, and once more, Menak rose golden in my path to greet me, and I flew back swiftly and landed upon this Mahendra." The Vanars shouted his name until the sky resounded with it. They kissed their tails and leaped into the air, turning somersaults forward, backward, and sideways. Hanuman said gravely, "It is strange but true that the Rakshas has not yet harmed Sita. When I think of how he was sinned by holding her his prisoner, I am astonished he has not been consumed by terror. Then, as I told you, he is no ordinary Rakshas. He is a Tapaswin. Otherwise, touching her would have devoured him quicker than fire. His eyes brimmed with tears. Hanuman said, "Oh, when I think of how she laid a blade of grass between herself and him, like a sword, my heart bleeds at a woman as brave as she should suffer as she does. She could so easily make Ravan ashes with the fire of her chastity. But she wants Ram to rescue her. She believes that that is the way of Dharma. Why, when I offered to carry her out of Lanka, she refused, saying she could not willingly allow anyone but Ram to touch her. But how she suffers every moment. We must hurry. We must not leave her here, there for long." Angad cried, "Uncle Jamwan's command we can raise Lanka, or what you have left of it, Hanuman. I shall kill Ravan myself. I too am a master of the Brahmastra, the Indra, and the Vayavya. Indrajit I can kill easily, and Hanuman can finish the rest. Let us go with Dvivind, Pans, Neel, and Mend, who all have boons from the Devas. The handful of us will crush Ravan's legions and bring Sita back. If we return to Kishikanda and tell Sugriv that we found Sita but have not brought her back, he surely won't be pleased." Jaman smiled at the prince's eagerness, but he said quietly, "I have no doubt you will prevail against the Rakshas. But take thought that Sita herself wants Ram to come to Lanka to rescue her. She believes that is the way of the Dharam. I say we should go back to Ram and tell him everything. Let us leave the rest up to him." Hanuman agreed with Jamwan, and Angad gave up his impetuous plan. Through the darkness of night which had fallen around them, the monkeys set out at once by starlight on their journey home to Kishikanda. The king's vineyard. Early the next morning, after traveling all night by jungle paths and treeways, Angad's Vanar army arrived at the outskirts of Kishikanda. On the fringes of the hidden city, within the green valley in which it was built, lay Sugriv's jealously guarded Madhuvan, his private vineyard. His uncle Dadimukh tended to it, and here he made and stored the choicest wines for the king's cellar. The monkeys, let me point it out, in the Valmiki's Ramayan, the Hindi Ramayan, it does not talk about the wine. They say Madhuvan, where Madhu was being created. Madhu is what? Honey. Honey, not wine. Okay. So the monkeys who had come from the south were already in high spirits. When they reached the Madhuvan, someone cried, "We bring joyful news for our king. He will not be angry if we taste his wine today." So they drank the Madhu over there, the honey, not the wines. Okay. "What about the guards of the Madhuvan?" cried another Vanar. But Hanuman himself said, "Leave the guards to me. Today you shall drink to your heart's content." Angad's army stormed into the king's vineyard, where his wines were stored in great vats. Like an invasion they came, and not in fine goblets, nor even from wooden bottles did they drink. They tipped the vats over and swilled straight out of them. Dadimukh's protests fell on deaf ears. When he tried to threaten them, they dragged him through the Madhuvan, pulled his beard, and ripped his clothes. The honeyed wine went potently to their heads, and in no time every Vanar was drunk. Some sang, others laughed and wept, others jumped high into the air and turned somersaults and cartwheels. Most of them could not walk steadily any more. Though they danced all right, they swarmed into the trees and played riotous games in the branches, swinging from tree to tree, leaping down and chasing each other, shouting at the tops of their voices. Hanuman cried to that army, "Drink your fill. Today is a day for celebrating." The Vanars needed no encouragement. They drank Sugriv's finest wines in vatfuls. Dadimukh tried again to stop them because they were now doing fair damage among the delicate wines. They laughed and began to pick the sharp fruit, crying that the grape on the vine was headier than the wine in the vats. Now Angad cried, "Let them drink. They come with joyful news for the king." The desperate Dadimukh ordered the guards of the Madhuvan to stop the drunken monkeys, but they were no match for the fighting warriors of the king's army. Roaring, Hanuman himself joined the fray, and the guards beat a hasty retreat. The drinking and the revelry continued. Dadimukh withdrew and said to his monkeys, "Let us go and tell the king. He is on Prasarvan." Through the nimble treeways, Dadimukh and his monkeys flew to Sugriv. The Vanar king sat with Ram, whom he now visited every day to comfort him, and also because he himself found deep solace in the company of the Blue Prince, ineffable peace, which surpassed the pleasure he had in his queen's arms. Dadimukh prostrated himself at his nephew's feet and lay there, obviously distraught. Sugriv asked sharply, "What is the matter, Dadimukh?" Tears in his eyes, that solemn and elegant monkey told him how Angad's Vanars had stormed his Madhuvan and were drunk in Sugriv's favorite sanctuary. He sobbed, "Hanuman and Angad attacked us when we tried to stop the others." Lakshman was standing nearby. He asked, "Why does Dadimukh come here with the tears in his eyes?" Sugriv turned to Lakshman and a smile stirred on his lips. "He wants me to punish Angad's army for ruining my Madhuvan and drinking all my best wine." And Sugriv said, "I won't punish them. They wouldn't drink my wine unless they have come with good news." Sugriv said, Dadimukh looked downcast. Sugriva went on blithely, "I am certain that Hanuman has found Sita." Sugriv turned to Dadimukh. "Uncle, they must have found Sita or they wouldn't dare drink my wine. Tell Angad, Jamwan, and Hanuman that I am impatient to hear their news." A little dazed, poor Dadimukh went back to the Madhuvan, but Sugriv was elated. He could keep his promise to Ram that be she anywhere at all, his Vanars would find Sita. He was pleased that at least in some measure he could repay his debt to the prince. Most of all, he was happy that at last a ray of hope shone into his human friend's misery. So this is the end of this chapter. Okay. So Lord, I have seen Sita. That is the next chapter. When chastened Dadimukh came back to the Madhuvan, he found most of the monkeys asleep on the ground and in tree forks. He presented himself before Angad with folded hands and said, "Forgive me, my prince. Forgive my guards for trying to spoil your army's enjoyment. I have just been to the king to complain about you." But he said, "Welcome them to my Madhuvan, for I am sure they bring good news. Tell Angad, Hanuman, and Jamvan that Ram, Lakshman, and I wait impatiently for them on Prasarvan." Angad blew a blast on his hunting horn, and his army rose out of its stupor. Thousands of Vanars, scattered across those woods, shouted their prince's name and stood groggy before them. Some were unsteady on their feet, but every last one was ready to jump to his command. Angad called to his people, "Ram and Sugriv are waiting for our news. We must go to Prasarvan." Cheering Angad and Hanuman, Ram and Sugriv, that long armed legion flew along to Prasarvan. Through the treeways they swung, and where there were no trees to swing through, they loped along the trails the jungle folk had made on the ground. Meanwhile, on Prasarvan, Sugriv went to Ram and said, "They have found her. They must have found your Sita, or they would not enter my Madhuvan. Besides, they have crossed the limit of time I set for them. They would not come home at all unless they had good news. Ram, I am sure our Hanuman has discovered Sita." They heard the commotion of Angad's army, still far from sober, roaring its way up Prasarvan. The excited monkeys chased each other as they came. With pride in their eyes, Sugriv watched his people swarm up the slope. Every Vanar walked tall. They shouted their delight to the sun. the sky and the wind, and whoever else cared to hear them. And if any doubt lingered in Sugriv's mind that they had found Sita, it vanished when he heard his monkeys climb the hill. At Sugriv's side, Ram sat hardly breathing. With Angad, Jamwan, and Hanuman at its head, their faces shining, the army arrived at the cave mouth. The leaders prostrated themselves at the feet of Sugriv, Ram, and Lakshman. Now Hanuman bowed again and again at Ram's feet, and he cried, Lord, I have seen Sita. Like the sun at dawn after a long night of fear, a smile appeared on Ram's dark face. He touched Hanuman's head with his hand in a loving blessing, and a tumult broke out there as every one ran forward to babble the tale of how Sita was found on Lanka, each one as if it was just his own story. Some cried that she was unharmed, others how sad she was. Others said she was like a doe surrounded by tigresses among the Rakshasas. Others told of Trijta's dream. Others how Hanuman savaged the Ashokwan. Some described Hanuman's rout of Ravan's forces, then some spoke of Indrajit and the Brahmastra. More of Hanuman in Ravan's Sabha, and others of the burning of Lanka. So it came out abruptly and altogether, the end, the middle, and the beginning, and no one could make head or tail of it. His eyes moist with hope, Ram raised his hand. I thank you, I thank you, my friends, for bringing me news that Sita is safe. Now tell me, what did she say to me? Hanuman had not told anyone about the message Sita sent. A little shamefaced, the monkeys made way for the son of the wind to stand before Ram once more and relate his adventure himself. Embarrassed, they said, You finished the story, Hanuman. You will tell it best. Ram and Lakshman stifled smiles while joy tugged at their hearts. Hanuman came before Ram. He turned his face to the south, where Sita was Ravan's prisoner. He bowed in that direction with folded hands and said quietly, Ram, I leaped across the southern sea to find Sita. With my father's power, I leaped 100 yojans. There in the city of Lanka, where Ravan rules, I saw Sita in an Ashok one, where he holds her prisoner. She hardly eats or drinks, but sustains herself by thinking of you. Some Rakshasas guard her and try to persuade her to yield to Ravan. She saw no way of escaping, nor any hope of you finding her. The morning I saw her, she had decided to take her life. Smiling modestly, Hanuman told how he had sat on the Shimshup tree and chanted the history of the Ikshvakus. How at first she had been terrified that he was Ravan, came disguised as a monkey, how slowly he won her trust. Hanuman said, Sita sent this message to you. Somehow thinking of you, I will stay alive for a month more. But after that, Ravan will kill me. Save me, Ram, before the month ends. I gave her your ring, and she was as happy as if she had seen you standing before her. He drew out the chudamani Sita had given him and handed it to Ram. Lowering his voice, Hanuman said, She asked me to remind you of the day in Chitrakoot when the crow attacked her. She asked me to remind you of the time when you marked her brow with the tilak of dust from the Mansila stone. She said she is waiting for you to save her, and that every moment apart from you is an abyss. Ram held the jeweled Chudamani, and a sob racked him. Choking, he said to Sugriva, Her father gave her this when we were married, and she wore it at the wedding. How beautiful she was on that day. Indra himself once gave Janak this heirloom. When I look at it, I see Dashrath, Janak, and my Sita before my eyes. I feel she is here beside me. Ram shook as if with a fever and cried to Lakshman, Lakshman, I see her face when I hold this golden thing. She weeps for me, my brother. He turned to Hanuman. Tell me everything, she said, noble Hanuman. What you say will be like water on the lips of a man dying of thirst. Oh, if she stays alive for a month, she will live longer than I will, for I will not last another moment without her. Oh, Hanuman, take me to my Sita now. He calmed himself. But first, tell me what she said. Tell me everything. Ram clasped Hanuman's hand and Hanuman led him away into the cave. Alone, he told Ram everything he had seen and heard in Lanka. All that he had observed about Sita, all that she had said to him. He began with the Sampati, the eagle, who directed them to Lanka. Then he described how he crossed the sea and how he found Sita. In painstaking detail, Hanuman dwelt on his meeting with her in the Ashokvan. Every breath she drew, each word she uttered, he related carefully and vividly. He said, I have assured her that your love is constant and that you will come swiftly to Lanka with an army of Sugriva's monkeys and Jamvan's bears to rescue her from the Rakshas. She waits anxiously for you, Ram, knowing you won't fail her and that soon Ravan will be meat for the scavengers of the ocean isle. Ram smiled bravely to hear what Hanuman said. So this is the end of this chapter and end of this kand also. And what was the name of this kand? Sundara Kanda. Sundara Kanda. Okay. Remember, we started with the Bal Kand, then Ayodhya Kand, then Aryanak Kand, then Kishkinda Kand. Then this is the end of Sundar Kand. Two more Kands, so Yuddha Kanda and Uttar Kanda. They are left. Okay. So any question, comment?
No, I just was going to say Sundar Kant when you asked that. So I unmuted myself. But that's okay. It was a nice ending. I loved the fun the monkeys had. Sometimes they have to be monkeys. So they were monkeys for a while.
Yeah, they were monkeys. They just they were bringing the best news, so they knew that they won't be punished, and they did not get punished. So
the animal nature had to be shown also versus the human nature. So
yeah, and
humans are not very.
And we all have animal nature in us too, right?
Yeah, I know. When it comes to wine, yes.
But I just pointed it out that there was no wine. In Valmiki Ramayana, it just says Madhu. Madhu does not mean wine.
But they were not, the whole concept might not have been there.
Yeah.
But it's, Sugriv also was very much into drinking. So they had to kind of combine.
Yeah, they thought that wine is being made over there. Maybe king did, but
it was a grape vineyard or whatever.
Yeah, grapevine. It was if it was a honey was being gathered over there, so it must be a different fruits
vineyard.
Over there. So I mean,
that's okay.
Yeah, that's all right. To me, we are not judging. All we are doing is just trying to see how they served Ram and how much Ram ached for Sita and how much Sita ached for Ram. To me, I think that is the most touching thing.
Yeah,
their love for
that's why in the husband-wife relationship and all this vratas and karva chauth and all is reminding us of the devotion to the husband.
Yeah, devotion, love, because this love, the power of love is the one which takes us towards God.
Yeah.
Love is not a bad thing. Yeah. Love. Okay. So Yuddha Kanda, let's see. How does this start over here? So they are still on that Prasarvan. Ram's eyes shone when he heard Hanuman's adventure in Lanka. Hugging the Vanar, the blue prince cried, before today, I had heard of Garud and Vayu crossing the ocean. Now Hanuman the Vanar has leaped across the waves out of his love. He has ravaged impregnable Lanka and returned alive to bring us his news. Matchless one, it saddens me that poor as I am today, I can repay you only with an embrace. Tears running down his face, he embraced Hanuman again. Ram controlled himself and said quietly, "It is true, we have found Sita, yet through Hanuman vaulted the ocean as if it were a puddle of rainwater. How will the rest of us cross the yawning sea?" The Varners all nodded their heads and murmured their agreement. Gloom settled on the company. Then Sugriv cried, "Ram, it is not right that you fear these trifles as another man may. In Dharam, this is nothing. Can just a sea stand between Ram and his love? Can death, who is the widest of the seas? I say no. We will cross the ocean, all of us. Look at the faces of my monkeys, Ram. Look carefully and tell me if you see a single Vanar who would not gladly leap into a fire for you. No, there is no one here who does not love you better than his life. Then how can you doubt the ocean shall be crossed?" He paused and saw Ram smile. The Vanars cheered their king deafeningly. Sugriv said, "To my mind, it seems a bridge must be built across Varun's kingdom of waves before our army can cross into Lanka. I say to you, once the bridge is built, you will see my Vanar's valor. You will see the Ravan's corpse lie upon the earth. Only do not succumb to doubt. Don't let grief be your master. Rather, harness your rage fiercely in your heart and let it be your weapon. We will surely kill Ravan and rescue Sita. You must believe this, Ram." The Vanars cheered again, but though what Sugriv said gave some heart to Ram, he was still somber. Then, shrugging off his despondency and drawing himself erect, he said, "You are right, my friend. We will find a way to cross the ocean because we must. If we cannot build a bridge to take us over the waves, I will drain the sea with my astres and we will walk to Lanka on dry land to confront Ravan." Ram turned to Hanuman. "Tell me all there is to know about Ravan's city. Tell me every detail you saw. When, in your wisdom, you decided to look it over. Omit nothing, my friend. Paint a picture for us so that Lanka rises before our eyes and we see her turrets sparkling in the sun." Hanuman described the Rakshas's city, leaving out no sight he had seen, however trivial. He did not belittle Ravan's Rakshasa guard, he praised them, but he said the Vanars, who could grow vast or tiny at will, and who were all fearless fighters, would be more than a match for that army of darkness, the Vanars, with Dharam on their side and Ram of Ayodhya to lead them. Angad, Dvivid, Mend, and the rest of us will not fail you, Ram. All you have to think of now is an auspicious time for us to set out. Once more, the Vanars leaped into the air and cried out their king's name and Ram's, Hanuman's, and Angad's, and the names of all the chieftains, one after the other. Ram and Lakshman imprinted Hanuman's description of Lanka on their hearts as if their lives depended on remembering each detail. Below Mehandra. When Hanuman declared they must choose a proper Mahurat to set out for Lanka, Ram shaded his eyes and stared briefly at the sky. He said, "The sun is at his zenith. This is the hour called Vijay. If we set out at once for Lanka, our mission will not fail. Today the moon is in the Uttra Nakshatra, but tomorrow he will be in Hasta. We must leave immediately if we are to take death to the Rakshas across the sea. Let Neel go in advance through the jungle of fruit trees with part of our army. But Neel, beware the Rakshasas have not poisoned either the fruit or the pools in the one you pass through. They may well do this when they learn of our purpose. Let Gaj, Gavya, Gavaksh, and Rishb lead armies from here, and let Hanuman carry me upon his shoulders as Ravat does Indra. Let Angad carry Lakshman as Sarvabhaum does Kuber. Let us set out with courage and determination in our hearts. Ram spoke bravely now. He was not dejected anymore, but full of hope, like the noble Kshatriya he was. A beaming Sugriv sounded a clarion blast on his jungle horn. He shouted orders to his people to set out. Like a wave across the hillside, a flash flood of monkeys, the Vanars swept down Prasarvan and flew along the quick paths of the trees. Over mountain and through forest, they swung with lithe, long arms toward Mehandra and the sea beyond. The sun began to sink even as they went, and from Angad's shoulders, Lakshman cried to Ram, "You will soon be back where you belong, upon the throne of Ayodhya, with Sita at your side. Look, the omens of the sky, the beasts and the trees are auspicious all around us." When Ram looked, he saw the sky was specklessly clear in every direction, and the sun full of soft brilliance. Yet Shukra rose, glowing behind them as they went. The seven rishis around the northern star Dhruv and Dhruv also were clear and shone down on them. In the south, Vishwamitra galaxy, where he created for Trishanku, was plain. Vishak sparkled, the sacred asterism of the house of Ikshvaku. Lakshman smiled. The breeze caresses us and the birds sing in joy. Ram smiled back at his brother, and now a mood of elation took him also. He cried, "The forest streams run like crystal, and the scents of the flowers on the branches fill my heart with hope." "The end of our misfortunes is near," said Lakshman. The Vanars pressed on south, cutting across the path of the sinking sun and bearing slightly to the east. Through the green awnings of many forests, they flew easily through branches, over brown hill, and across frothing river. Finally, as the sun was poised above the southern sea, its rim touching the water, they stood breathless on Mount Mehandra. From the summit of the mountain, they stared across the smoky sea, which faced them again, roaring at their feet. Ram saw the stupendous obstacle in his path and was reminded sharply how right he had been to have misgivings about the crossing to Lanka. On and on stretched the ocean, which thundered up at them in disdain. Waves crashed against the rocks, piled round and smooth at the foot of Mahendra. Varun seemed to mock them with his expanse, his depth, and his ancience. Ram, Sugriv, and Lakshman climbed down the hill to the small wood below it. Ram said somberly, "My hope wanes to see the ocean before us. With its island hidden by the horizon, let us make a camp and rest here. We must consider carefully how we will cross the formidable Lord of Rivers." Like another sea themselves, the Vanars thronged the shore in tides that flowed down the hillside. They came to answer their king's call and gathered round them on golden sands lit by the last light of the day. Briefly, Ram and Lakshman were left alone together in the little wood. Ram said quietly, "Nothing makes me as anxious now as the short time Ravan has left Sita before he kills her. Only a fleeting month, of which 3 days are already gone. Lakshman, my heart is weak with fear that we may not be in time to save her." And Ram broke down and sobbed. "Oh, Vayu," he cried, "blow from here to where my love sits, and stroke her with the very fingers of air with which you touch me. Then blow those same drafts back to me so I see her clearly before my eyes and she knows I am coming." How piteously she must have cried, "Ram, save me," when the Rakshasa carried her away. My brother, they say time heals every wound. But this wound of being separated from Sita grows more painful with every moment that passes, as if flaming knives are being turned in it. It consumes me, Lakshman. It robs me of my manliness. Can you begin to imagine how I long for her? Her touch, the look of her eyes, her tender caress, the sound of her sweet voice. Can you imagine how I yearn to be rid of the sorrow that feeds on my very life? To cast it from me like soiled clothes, to kill the Rakshas and to have my Sita back? Lakshman, hell and madness clutch at me, and I have to thrust them away with the knowledge that she lives, that out there beyond this sea, my Sita is still alive. Lakshman took his brother gently by the hand. He led him out of those woods to the damp sand. A stirring wind blew around them. In the distance, the scarlet sun sank into the waves. Ram sank down on his knees in prayer. Quietening the anguish in his heart as best he could, he worshipped pristine Surya Dev. So, any question, comment? Should I continue, Jyoti?
Yep.
Okay. It's a long, a couple of pages, but let's just finish it because now the story goes back to Ravan, what is happening over there in Lanka. And then we'll end it with this chapter and um, and finish the class with the bhajan. So the king's brother. Meanwhile, in Lanka, Ravan sat in council with his ministers. He was terrible to see in his fury, controlled and sinister. Ravan said softly, "A low creature of the jungle, a monkey, comes to Lanka and sets its blaze. By himself, he wipes out a good part of my army and escapes with his life. The Ashok one is burned down. Our people's homes are razed. More than half my own palace is gutted, and the temple of our Devi of Lanka is ashes." All 10 heads were clear in their malignant cluster around the central one, now as feral as the rest. Lips twitching, they glowered. He paused, drew a deep breath, and gazed around him, from face to blenched face in his Shaba. Hanuman had shocked them all, as they never believed they could be within their smooth walls that no lizard could scale. In that court which had escaped Hanuman's conflagration, silence reigned. Restraining the rage that surged in him, Ravan continued in deadly calm, chilling his minister's blood. It is said a wise king is guided by his friends and counselors who have his welfare at heart. A wise king knows the fruit of what he does depends on fate and the divine powers that rule men's lives. He who acts in dharam but walks alone and pays no heed to his minister's counsel is less than the best of kings. But the king who pays no heed to the fruit of his deeds, who has no belief in providence, is a hasty one, foolish and doomed to failure. Ravan's ministers sat tensely around their sovereign. Slowly, deliberately, he spoke to them, at times staring into this one's eyes or another's, then gazing at out again at the blue-green sea below the wide windows. Ravan said, "There are also three kinds of advisors. Those who look clearly at every problem in the light of the wisdom of the Shastras, those who debate, argue, and disagree among themselves, and yet arrive at the same conclusion at the first. And finally, those who obstinately follow their inclinations and prejudices and will never agree with any opinion that differs from their own, however reasonably." He scrutinized their faces. "My loyal friends, our spies tell me that Ram has gathered an army of Vanars and Rikshas to attack our city. From what I hear of this man, he can drain the ocean with his astra and walk across its bed to our shores. Somehow I have no doubt that he and his legion of apes will arrive in Lanka. We must defend ourselves, and I want to hear your counsel on how we can best do this. I want to hear how you think we should confront the danger that threatens us." They glanced at one another. Then Ravan's chief minister, Prahast, whose son Jambu Mali was killed by Hanuman, stood up and cried, only a foolish counselor will allow his king to be anxious when the greatest army in all the world is his to command. We were unprepared for yesterday's encounter with the monkey, and doubtless he was helped by some sorcery and an evil crossing of stars in the sky. But not every day is the same, and your army is the one you led into Varun's city under the waves. Bhogwati, and we annihilated its great nags. This is the army with which you vanquished Kuber on Kailash and became lord of the earth. My lord, you are Ravan, who brought the Asur Madhu to Lanka in chains. Maya himself gave his daughter Mandodari to be your wife. The denizens of the Patals tremble at the mention of your name. They know you are the greatest master of Maya that ever lived. Why does such doubt beset you today? Who slew Varun's sons? Or do you really think this Ram, who is a mere human, is an equal of the enemies I have named? Remember how easily Indrajit captured the monkey Hanuman. Indrajit by himself can obliterate the race of Vanars. Or has my lord forgotten that your son is called Indrajit because he once brought the king of the Devas to your feet, bound in the crystal coils of his astra, and only when Brahma begged you, you sent Indra back to Amravati? Mighty Ravan, I don't know what darkens your mind with such anxiety today. Why do you even ask for our counsel when it is not needed? It is obvious what the fate of this Ram and his monkeys will be when they land on Alanka's shores. I say, send Indrajit to face them. Then we will deal with what remains. Another like minded minister echoed what Prahasta said. You conquered the Devas, the Asurs, the Gandharvas, the Pishachas. All the kings of Swarag, Bhumi, and Patal are your vassals. They should. Why should Ravan pay any mind to a puny man who dares come to our shores with a ragtag army of monkeys? Prahast, who was Ravan's favorite, cried again, send me into battle and see what I do to the upstart Ram. Send me before anyone else, and I will rid the earth forever of her burden of monkeys. The grief of Jambumali's death weighed on Prahast's heart. His eyes were full of fire when he spoke, and he meant each word he said. But then the others were not to be left behind. Every minister, they cried, that he could single handedly kill Ram and his Vanars. They cried how easy their victory would be had their king forgotten their courage, how they had fought at his side in 100 battles and the heroes they had killed. 10 smiles were beginning to brighten 10 demonic heads of the Emperor of Evil. But suddenly Vibhishan stood up and waited for the king to let him speak. Ravan raised an imperious hand to silence the excited Sabha. He said to his brother, yes, Vibhishan, Ravan, three methods are advocated for success in any undertaking: Sam, Dan, and Bhed, conciliation, gifts, and argument. Only when these gentler means fail should one use dand, force. I have heard so much about Ram that he has touched my heart. He has conquered his passions, most of all his anger. How can one oppose a man who is a master of himself? Not only that, but the gods are on his side. If you truly want to understand what it is you face, think reasonably of what Hanuman achieved. He leaped across the ocean. Was this an ordinary feat? Hanuman was only a messenger. Surely the one he serves is far greater than he. Think of what Hanuman did here, what he reduced Lanka to. Think calmly and without prejudice, however comforting it may be to deceive yourself. I beg you, do not underestimate this enemy, most of all because he has done nothing to offend you. What he did to Khar and the Rakshasas of Jansathan was not his fault. It was Khar who attacked Ram. And you know how cruel our cousin was. Some day, retribution had to come for his years of savagery to the rishis of the jungle. Dear Lord, I know you will not like hearing what I have to say next. My words will not be music to your ears, as Prahat's are. But you are my brother, and as I love you, I must speak the truth. Ravan, think of what you have done to Ram. For just a moment, reflect on the anguish you have caused him. You have taken his wife from him and brought her here as your prisoner. This is no ordinary sin, but the father of sins, the one that breeds all the others, which follow inexorably in its wake. Think, my brother, that if you had not committed this sin, no Hanuman would have crossed the sea to Lanka and gutted it. The gods still love you for your tapasya, and they have warned you. It is not too late. Heed the omens, give Sita back to Ram, and beg his pardon before you and all our people are destroyed. Ram walks the path of Dharam. He is that most dangerous of all enemies, the perfect man. The sin you have committed against him is like a deadly poison to yourself. Not merely your life, your soul is in peril. Relent, Ravan. I speak as your brother, and from my love for you, listen to what I say before it is too late. I speak for your people who already murmur among themselves that their king should return to the ways of peace. They are afraid Ram's us will end all this magnificence that is Lanka and their lives with it. Give Sita back before Ram comes to take her. That is the way of Dharam. 20 eyes on 10 grim faces gazed unwinkingly at Vibhishan. Not a muscle moved on any face to betray the feelings of the evil one. Without a word, Ravan waved his hand to indicate that the council was dismissed. His ministers bowed low to their king and left the Sabha without turning their backs on him. Ravan sat alone on his throne. He sat staring out at the sea from his windows, and tears like drops of fire rolled down his dark face. The next day, Vibhishan came early to Ravan's private chambers in another wing of the palace, which also had not been burned by Hanuman's fire. Outside, the first rays of the sun touched the sea awake to another morning. Vibhishan prostrated himself at his brother's feet. Ravan spoke no word, only stared at him out of tired, sleepless eyes. Vibhishan summoned his courage and said, evil omens have gathered over Lanka. They were first seen here and there on the day Sita entered our city, but today they are everywhere, out in the open like some plague. On the quarter of worship, the fires of sacrifice bellow with black smoke that reeks of excrement. The flames splutter with thousands of sparks and die out repeatedly, so they have to be kindled every half hour. The havis of offering crawls with ants and worms. Our animals are all listless and restive. The cows yield no milk, and the elephants refuse to touch their feed. The horses cry in the royal stables and whinny in fear as if they saw spectres of doom. You must have heard the crows keep up their raucous cawing through the night. They roost on your squadron of Vimanas. Our guards killed hundreds of the birds, but more flew down out of the darkness. If you look into the sky, you will see vultures and kites wheeling in it. They cry down shrilly as if Lanka were already littered with corpses for them to feast on. Jackals and hyenas roam the city streets by night and day and never stop howling. The omens speak plainly, Ravan, that we will not be able to withstand Ram's wrath. Spare your city its life, O king, and your people their lives. Let us all live in peace. Relent, my lord, before the Vanar army lands on Lanka's shores and the sky flames with Ram's astras. He paused, his face flushed in his anxiety to convince his brother, tears standing in his kind eyes. Vibhishan took Ravan's hand imploringly. But Ravan drew his hand away and said, "Listen to me, Vibhishan. I will never let her go. She is more precious to me than all the world, and she was born to be my queen. Let Ram come not with an army of monkeys, but with the host of heavens, and I will not give Sita up to him. Your counsel is the way of cowardice. How can a king like me heed such advice?" Vibhishan opened his mouth to speak again, but Ravan stood up tall over him and waved his brother away from his presence. So, this is the end of this chapter. Any question? Do we have Padmini?
Padmini?
Padmini didn't come today.
No,
So,
she's there. She's
No,
there.
I'm here.
she's there.
Namaste, Auntie.
Namaste, Padmini. If you can sing a bhajan.
It was so beautiful. I loved hearing the whole finishing of the Sundarkand. So on that note, I would like to sing a bhajan for Lord Hanumanji. It's okay?
Yeah, sure, sure.
मंगल मूरति राम तुलारे आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे मंगल मूरति राम तुलारे आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे हे बजरंग बली हनुमान हे महावीर करो कल्याण हे महावीर करो कल्याण तीनों लोक तेरा उजियारा दुखियों का तूने काज सवारा हे जगवंदन केसरी नंदन हे जगवंदन केसरी नंदन कष्ट हरो हे कृपा निधान कष्ट हरो हे कृपा निधान मंगल मूरति राम तुलारे आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे हे बजरंग बली हनुमान हे महावीर करो कल्याण हे महावीर करो कल्याण तेरे द्वारे जो भी आया खाली नहीं कोई लौटाया दुर्गम काज बना मनहारे मंगलमय दी जो वरदान मंगलमय दी जो वरदान मंगल मूरति राम दुलारे आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे हे भजरंग बली हनुमान हे महावीर करो कल्याण हे महावीर करो कल्याण तेरा सुमिरन हनुमत बीरा नासे रोग हरे सब पीरा तेरा सुमिरन हनुमत बीरा नासे रोग हरे सब पीरा राम लखन सीता मन बसिया राम लखन सीता मन बसिया शरण पड़े का कीजो ध्यान शरण पड़ेगा, कीजो ध्यान मंगल मूर्ति राम दुलारे, आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे। हे बजरंग बली हनुमान, हे महावीर करो कल्याण, हे महावीर करो कल्याण, करो कल्याण मंगल मूर्ति राम दुलारे, आन पड़ा अब तेरे द्वारे। हे बजरंग बली हनुमान, हे महावीर करो कल्याण, हे महावीर करो कल्याण, करो कल्याण, करो कल्याण। Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Thank you.